Welcome to this introduction on research paradigms. In this session, we're going to introduce you to the ologies, and they are ontology, epistemology, and axiology. As a starting point, when we think about research, we typically think about quantitative or qualitative. So if we look at quantitative first, that's a numbers-based or a numbers-orientated way of conducting research. And in terms of the methods, we typically think about questionnaires, observations, experiments, or maybe kind of testing in the sports science lab. And that gives us numbers or numerical data. And what we really look for in this type of study is that what we find is generalizable to a larger population. So we might conduct it on a smaller number, and what we find we can then upscale, and also the studies are replicable. So other people can pick up our study and test it in slightly different environments. And then we've got a qualitative approach, which is more of a language orientated approach, or essentially kind of using words and gathering opinions from people or people's perceptions. If you think about the typical methods that we might use in a qualitative approach, we're thinking about interviews. They could be individual or they could be group. We might be thinking about taking field notes. So we might be seeing something happening and we might be taking some field notes on what we see, linking that to observations. But in a quantitative approach, we might be kind of tally charting. In a qualitative approach, we might be writing what we see, and then it could be our own reflections. So we might undertake a program, we might experience something, and then we might reflect on that experience and kind of the process that we go through, whether it's through conversation or just us writing stuff down ourselves, that leaves us with kind of words with a language orientated piece of data. Now, to look at this in more of a simplistic method first, when we look at quantitative and qualitative, we can flip those words if we think about ontology, epistemology, and axiology, and we will go through each of those one at a time to kind of introduce you to them. But we can replace quantitative with positivism, and we can replace qualitative with interpretivism, or what we might call later on constructivism. Now, these are what we would call kind of two extremes of a spectrum. And when we get to it a bit later, I'm only really going to introduce something like a third option here. If you want to know more about this, there are several other epistemologies and ontologies out there, but we're going to kind of look at the extreme ends to start with. And it is more complicated than this, but I think this is useful as an introduction. So in terms of positivism, a positivist approach is essentially about building theories about the world or building theories about the topic and then testing them. And what we're doing when we test them is we're looking for an absolute truth. So we're looking, if we think about it as like a black and white answer, we're looking for the answer. This is the only way, or this is the right way. And therefore, typically, we're trying to be objective. We're trying to find what we see as being factual information. We want our information to be, or our findings, the truth, to be generalizable across the population because it's true. If it's true, then it generalizes across to the bigger population. Like we said earlier, it's replicable, but also it's scientific. And this typically would be a numerical approach, but where the confusion may lie is that positivism actually could also work in a qualitative approach, and interpretivism, as we'll talk about later, could work in a quantitative approach, but typically we see positivism as one extreme end, and the methodology we pick for that is quantitative. So if we look at interpretivism, with interpretivism, it is the opposite essentially because it's the other end of the spectrum. And what we're kind of saying with this is that it's context dependent. So it's not generalizable. It's not that we can make a finding and then say, well, this must be true across the population. This must be true if we upscale it. Actually, in an interpretivist approach, the context would determine what is true. So you can make a finding in a particular context, but in a different context, the finding can be very different. And we're okay with that as interpretivists. It's socially constructed. So like we said earlier about kind of language orientation, we might construct knowledge through interactions with people. For example, we might want to talk to other coaches, and those conversations we have, the process of interviewing or making notes on, or even just discussing informally, we come up with some findings, some data that's constructed through those social interactions. Arguably, that makes the data more subjective. I don't think it's as simple as one is objective and one is subjective, even though we label it that way. But I think it does make the data more subjective through this approach. It's more opinionated, it's more about a perception. And essentially, we're seeking understanding of the context and the experience of the person. So we're trying to understand their context and we're trying to understand what they experience, and then we're going to make some findings, or we're going to present our findings from that. Now, it does naturally fit a quantitative and qualitative approach, but as we said, it is slightly more complicated than that. Or actually, they essentially probably could work by flipping them, and it, in theory, could still work, even though typically a positivist approach is quantitative and an interpretive approach is typically qualitative. So what we're going to introduce you to next, and I think it's really important we do this, is ontology first. And ontology essentially is what is reality, or what is knowledge, or what even is truth. So anyone watching this, you may have an opinion, you may have a belief about what is a fact, what is knowledge, what is truth. And what you believe might be different to someone else. And that essentially is ontology. It's what we believe is knowledge, what we believe is reality. We'll cover that and we'll introduce that next. After that, we're going to explore epistemology. And epistemology essentially is the ways that we understand or interpret reality. So ontology is about what actually is knowledge, what is reality. Epistemology is what are the different ways that we can understand that? How can we make sense of it? And then the third one, about axiology, essentially is about our own values, our own ethics, our own morals, and how that affects the research process, or that affects how we receive information and what we do with that information when we receive it, because of our values. So ontology, we're going to start with. Now, if we think about ontology in a more simplistic way, we're just going to look at these three. But like I said earlier, you might want to watch more videos, you want to do some reading. There are more than this. But just for the purpose of this introductory video, we're just going to explore these three. The first one is a belief that there is a single truth. So therefore, the context isn't that important, or the people that you conduct this test on isn't that important, because there's only one answer. The next part of that is not only is there only one answer, but ultimately knowledge can be measured. We can measure knowledge. It's not subjective, it is objective, it's measurable, and there is a right and a wrong. And we call that a positivist approach, as we explored slightly earlier. The next approach is where there could be multiple truths, there could be multiple answers. And I guess we could look at this in a couple of ways. So the first way is different contexts may bring different answers, or different truths, or different pieces of knowledge. But also, even in the same context, there might be multiple answers to a question. There might be multiple answers to a problem. And that's okay. We're okay with that. So lots of people in this approach might say, it depends. If you ask them a question, they might say, it depends. It depends on the age of the participant. It depends on the context. It depends on how experienced they are. It depends on what's happening in front of them in that moment. So there could be multiple answers. And that is what we call a constructivist approach, or an interpretivist approach, as we used earlier. And then we've got this other approach, which is called, or we'll get to what's called in a second. But essentially, this is where reality, or the truth, or knowledge is constantly negotiated, is debated, and it's interpreted. And with this approach, there's a belief that knowledge should be examined using the best tools. So essentially, it's a pragmatic approach. It could be positivist at times. A pragmatic approach might say the best tool to answer this question is to use a positivist approach, to measure something, to find a single truth. But they might also say, actually, there might be multiple answers out there. So what's the best tool that we can use to find something in the most useful way? And that's a pragmatic approach. Epistemology is slightly different. We're still going to use the same three terms, but we're now into, well, what is knowledge? Do I believe that there's a single truth? Do I believe there's multiple truths? Or do I believe we're more pragmatic than that? And actually, depending on the question, we need to think about what's the best tools available to us to go and find an appropriate answer. Epistemology is about how I can know that reality. And if we think about positivism first, essentially all knowledge can be measured. We can use a sports science lab, we can test someone's heartbeat, we can test someone's running, we can put a program in place and around self-talk as a psychological process, and we can measure whether that improves performance in a numerical, data-driven way. So that's a positivist approach. The way that we know reality is we measure it and we find out what the right answer is. In a constructivist or interpretivist approach, we're essentially looking to determine the underlying meaning of the question. Apologies. So we're essentially trying to uncover the underlying meaning of that question. And the underlying meaning might be espoused in lots of different variables. Yeah, some of those I spoke about earlier, like age, it might be demographic of the person, it might be their experience, it might be the context they're in, it might be the time, it might be how they're feeling in that moment. So there's lots of variables that can influence an answer. And essentially in the constructivist approach, we're trying to discover the kind of underlying meaning of that. And we might need to dig a bit deeper to do that. It might not be as simple as, simple is not the right word because measuring something is really difficult, but it might not be we can measure something and that's the answer. It might be we need to dig a little bit deeper. We need to find out why. We need to find out why this is happening. And ultimately that might not be measurable. And in the constructivist approach, it isn't measurable. And if we look at pragmatism, so essentially that we should examine something using the best tools to solve the problem in front of us. Whatever the approach is, we're going to be pragmatic about that. So these are our limitations. These are the tools available to us. It could be we're limited by resource, by time. It could be that the people we're studying are limited in a certain way. And based on all of that, we're going to use the best tools we can to solve that problem. And that's how we're going to know whether what reality is or what the truth is. And in terms of axiology, so axiology is our values, and I guess that kind of links to kind of ethics and morals and what we believe is right and wrong in terms of the way we behave and the way we conduct ourselves. But essentially, with axiology, it's seeking to understand the meaning, the nature, and the origin of the notions of value or our values and value judgment. So a few questions we might think about. What do we value? What are our own personal values? What value should guide our research? So we've got some personal values and we're going to use them to guide our research. But that leads us on to that final point at the end. Can research be neutral? I'm not sure it can be personally. So maybe it can be. Maybe we can. And in a positivist approach, the researcher ideally will remove themselves from the research process as much as they can because they might influence the research. So they may, for example, some research may get someone else to conduct the testing, set up the apparatus and bring the data, and then they just make sense of it. So they're trying to avoid influencing the study. Now, a constructivist or an interpretivist may argue that that's really difficult, maybe even impossible, because the way that we just set our research up at the beginning stage will be based on our own personal values. So it will be biased to a degree because we are shaping that. Now, how biased it is or how much our personal values shape the research we conduct, well, that can be a small amount all the way through to we've completely shaped it and our bias, our own beliefs is kind of all over it. Now, I don't fully know the answer to that question, but it's something that is worth wondering whether actually the research that we're thinking about conducting, do our own personal beliefs and our values about what we believe about the topic, what we believe is right and wrong, how much does that influence, how much does that shape how we are going to conduct the research?